read my columns, they always have somewhat of a faithful tone to it, to a certain degree, because my faith is a central part of who I am as a human being. I sometimes joke that I'm just a simple country lawyer. The truth of the matter is, it's probably better to describe me as a simple country preacher who happens to be a lawyer. So that's like my self-definition. And I was saying earlier that, all through law school, I actually pastored a church through law school. I pastored a church during my first couple of years in the legislature. So for me, this is basically who I am, being in a church and understanding how my faith works in the public context. So I've been working on something over the last few years, and this is probably the first time I've had a chance to really start talking about it outside of writing about it. So I've been working on something called Moving Toward a New Theology of American Civic Faith. And that's kind of where my brain has been over the last several years, trying to work it out. What does that mean? So you're going to be partners with me today as I talk about it for the first time. Not quite a TED Talk, it's a M.Div talk, which is probably cooler than a TED Talk. Because, everybody could be TED, not everybody can be M.Div Presbyterian, right? And not everyone gets to speak in a cool sanctuary like this. When I walked in, I was like, I'm kind of digging the vibe in this sanctuary. The other sanctuary is really cool, but I'm really digging the vibe in this sanctuary. This is kind of old school. It reminds me of the church I grew up in Washington, D.C., Faith Baptist Church, which was a small little Black Baptist church. Sanctuary wasn't much bigger than this, but it looked and felt much like this. Had the same pews, except you have nicer cushions on your pews. Our pews were hardwood, and I think they were intended for the kids in the church to stay awake during the entire church service. So this kind of gives me that same vibe of the church. So I'm kind of dealing with this. I'm digging with this. But let me jump into this because I only have about 20 more minutes before I start and take any questions on this. So this is probably something I started really thinking about way back when I was in seminary with your now pastor, retired Pastor Ian. And when I was, in seminary, I was first truly exposed to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church. And I want to lead with Bonhoeffer to a certain degree because we're in an environment, and this is my comment on the election, I suspect, we're in an environment where a lot of folks are questioning what's with the church, what's going on, especially what's with the Christian church, and more accurately, what's with the evangelical Christian church. And those of us in this room, we probably understand the difference between the evangelical church and the mainline church and those who are children of the Reform movement. And a lot of us understand that implicitly because you're sitting here, and we understand it explicitly as well. But your average American does not understand the difference between those folks who go to M.Div Presbyterian Church as opposed to those who might go to just pick your typical big box evangelical church. Most Americans aren't going to notice the difference between the seminary where I attended, Isle School of Theology, and Denver Seminary, which is right down the road from Isle School of Theology. Or they won't notice the difference between who I am as an American Baptist minister as opposed to a friend of mine who's a Southern Baptist minister. They don't understand that. So when they look at the church and they look at the role of the church in this past election, where it says that well over 80% of evangelicals supported Trump, folks look at that and think there's some hypocrisy here. They look at that and think there's something not jiving here. And over the past few months, there's been a conversation here at Montview and a few other churches, congregations against white Christian nationalism around some of the topics that I'm going to talk about today very briefly. I'm not going to talk about white Christian nationalism per se, even though it's hard not to. It's a thing. That's not going away anytime soon. It's a thing. But I've been thinking a lot about, so in this environment, what does it look like for those of us who call ourselves faithful? And what does it look like for, more specifically, for those of us who call ourselves faithful to Christ to be a witness in a world that we live in today? How do we create a counter-narrative? And I think that's the word we have to start talking about now. How do we create a counter-narrative to what we see in the world in terms of what people think people of faith are, what Christian folks are? How do we counter that? And this is not too different from where Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church was during the rise of Adolf Hitler. Brief disclaimer here. I am not saying that Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler or that we're going into a period of a Nazi regime and a fascist regime here in the United States. But I'm also not saying we should not pay attention to historical precedent. So we should pay attention to historical precedent because the past does inform the future, but the past does not dictate what the present or the future can be. Only those of us who live here in this time and place can dictate what our present will be and what our future will be. But we should pay attention to history. And so when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany through a democratically elected process, generally speaking, and we should note that the German parliamentary system then was a little different than what we have here. So when he came to power, very quickly there were members of the church, and the official church of Germany was the Lutheran Church. And very quickly there were members of the Lutheran Church who aligned themselves with Adolf Hitler. They aligned themselves with Nazi Party ideology. Part of the reason they aligned themselves with Nazi Party theology because their self-identity was not with Christ first. Their self-identity was with the mechanisms of the state. And they embraced the mechanisms of the state to force their narrow worldview on other people. They also saw their Jewish brothers and sisters as somehow being a threat to who they were as Germans in Germany at that particular time. So when Hitler came to power, they found someone who gave voice to all their biases, all their bigotries, all their anti-Semitism, all their prejudices about not just Jews, but about gays and lesbians, about the Romani population. Does it sound similar or to anyone sitting in the room? And so the Lutheran Church at the time gave themselves completely to the Nazi Party, so much so that the head bishop of the Lutheran Church ended up being appointed, so to speak, by Adolf Hitler to be in charge of the Lutheran Church in Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others decided, yo, dude. I don't think Dietrich Bonhoeffer really said, yo, dude, but it's my version of yo, dude. He might have said, yo, dude. I don't know how to say yo, dude in German. Yo, dude, I don't know. And I don't want to pretend to speak German because German is every time I hear someone speak German, I think they're cursing at me. So I know, it does say, Achtung, guten Morgen. I'm like, really, good morning? That sounds very you're not like, you don't want me to have a good morning because you say, and you say good night, guten Tag. I'm like, really? Really? You really want me to have a good night? I don't think so. So I'm not going to pretend to speak German. And so what happened was Dietrich Bonhoeffer and members of the Confessing Church said, this is not who we are as people of God. This is not who we are as people of Christ. We don't embrace hatreds. We don't embrace bigotries. We don't embrace all the things that came with Nazi Germany. In fact, this is what he starts to talk about in The Cost of Discipleship. And if you ever get a chance to read this, you need to read The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I should note that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, like most good theologians, was influenced by a Morehouse man. Sorry, I may have gone to a little school called Morehouse. But he was influenced by a Morehouse man named Howard Thurman. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as a side note, spent his formative years as a theologian at Union Theological Seminary in Harlem in New York City and attended the Great Abyssinia Baptist Church in New York City, which is one of the great bastions of social justice, still is to this date. And they just celebrated their 200th anniversary as a church this year. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer was very much enmeshed in the social justice traditions of the black church. I hear he may have been preached like a black preacher. He may have had a hoop. Who knows? We don't know about these things. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says that the church has an obligation to display humanity to the least of these. And that part of that, and not part of it, all of it is dictated by the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. And then the second commandment, which is as important as the first one, love your neighbors as you love yourself. He said that was pretty important. And actually, it is kind of pretty important, because if you, like my little Bible here, that I probably should get a bigger version, because even with my glasses on, the print is still small. Where it's listed here in the Bible, and as my mother made me learn, if it's written in red, Jesus said it, so it's kind of important. So that part is actually written in red, so it's pretty important. So that's what he said. That's the baseline of how people of faith live our faith out in public life, is that we understand that we have to love our God with all our heart, but we have to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, which gets to the basics of the cross. The vertical relationship and the horizontal relationship. The divine and our neighbors, they can't be excluded from each other. It's an intersection that happens. And that's the basis of living our faith out in public. So which gets me, and I'm going to move ahead rather rapidly, because this could actually be a whole series about this whole notion of this new theology of American civic faith. I was going to call it American civic religion, but I didn't want to give it that kind of thing. So I wanted to make it more about faith, because people hear religion and they think about a set of regimes, a set of doctrines, and so to speak. But faith is broader in my estimation. It's about how you live out your life, as opposed to following a set of dictates and a set of rules in terms of how the law, so to speak. And the Apostle Paul talks about this notion of the law and how we need to move away from trying to align ourselves with the law. So I'm like, so what does this American civic faith look like? How do we get to this new theology of it? And then we go to one of my other favorite people, James Baldwin. And anyone who's around me long enough knows that I do too much talking about James Baldwin. I don't know if you could ever do too much James Baldwin. I don't know, but he's my spirit animal. I'm going to go with James Baldwin and Sojourner Truth are my spirit animals, as well as my mother, Corinne Carroll. And if you ever get tired of me talking about my mama, I don't know, it's your issue, not mine. But James Baldwin had something to say about how do we, and I don't know if he was necessarily thinking about what I'm talking about today, but I'm actually embracing it for what I'm talking about today. Because when I started thinking about how do we move towards this new theology of American civic faith, and I should briefly note that this idea of American civic faith is not something that I made up. There's a sociologist named Robert Beulah who first started writing about this idea of American civic faith in the 50s and 60s, about what are those things that bind us together, that create, and he actually called it America's civic religion. What are those things that bind us together as Americans, that common shared ideals that we all agree on as our touch points for how we understand what it means to be American. So he invented this idea, or he's the person who first put pen to paper to talk about what American civic faith is, what American civic religion is. And if you look at many of our institutions, I don't know how many of you here were Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, but institutions like that, actually Boy Scouts are now called Scouting USA, not the Boy Scouts anymore. We kind of moved away. And I'm an Eagle Scout, so the whole scouting thing has been central to my life for a long time. But if you look at the Boy Scouts in particular, there's this notion of things that bind us together in the Boy Scouts that kind of create this common place of conversation for us to understand what it means to be civically involved in America. You got the Scout Oath, you got the Scout Law, and I still remember them both wrote, Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Baseline. Oh, thank you. Checks in the mail. Send my check to her, Clover. Send my check to her. So how do we get back to this shared set of principles of what we believe to be American? Those things that Dr. King talked about when he said, all we're asking for is that America be true to what it says it is on paper. So James Baldwin had something to say about this. He says, if we're going to kind of revisit those things, if we're going to start over again, this is what we have to do. To do your first works over means to re-examine everything. Go back to where you started, or as far back as you can examine, all of it. Travel your road again and tell the truth about it. Sing or shout or testify, or keep it to yourself, but know from whence you came. That's hard for us in America, because this notion of American exceptionalism requires us to think that we're always on this forward path, first of all. Maybe that's second of all. First of all, American exceptionalism requires us to think that in America, we've always done the right thing no matter what. That somehow our hands are clean, there's no dirt on our hands. And then the second part of it is, I heard someone chuckle, but it's part of the whole debate about wokeness and anti-DEIism, is that this idea that if we talk about the past, if we talk about our history and have a legitimate, thoughtful, full conversation, transparent conversation about our history, somehow it denies this idea of American exceptionalism. But the truth of the matter is, for us to be an exceptional nation, there has to be a full-throated conversation about those things that have been problematic in the history of the United States of America. And James Baldwin is actually getting at that. Thank you. You can clap again. I know it's as close as I get to an amen at Montview. And so, Corey, don't look at me, you're gonna make me laugh. Corey Kalanick, my colleague, Sherman and Howard, Montview member. I don't know if I had to say Corey's name because it kept me from laughing.
Yeah, you can clap, that's okay.
So, in order for us to start having this conversation about creating a new theology of American civic faith, we have to reach back, as James Baldwin says, and re-examine our first things and start again. In fact, I feel like since I'm in a church, I have to briefly take a scripture. So in Revelation chapter 5, Revelation chapter 2, the writer of Revelation, John of Patmos, is directly writing to the church at Ephesus. And the church at Ephesus at that time is going through some things. They're in their feelings. They may have just had an election, who knows? But they were in their feelings. Some guy who has orange skin may have been elected president of Ephesus. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. So they may have been going through some things, and they were struggling, and they didn't really understand what was going on, and there was some dissent within the church. There was one faction of the church that believed one thing. There was one faction of the church that believed another thing, and John of Patmos wrote a letter to the church at Ephesus, and as part of the book of Revelation, he says, you all need to start again. You all need to return to your first love and understand what it really means to love Christ. You've done all the book theory right things. You know, you give the right alms, you pray the right prayers, you do the right services, you do all the things that you're supposed to do, but somehow you've lost the thing that brought you to Christ to begin with. You've lost your first love. You need to return to your first love. And for us to be involved, those of us who have faith, those of us who call ourselves people of Christ, and I'm going to quickly come to I'm not going to say I'm going to quickly come to a close, but I'm going to meander toward a close here, because I'm not going to, as the old folks would say, I'm not going to try to tarry too long, but I'm going to meander just a tad bit. So what was going on here was that he says that you got to return to your first love, to that thing that first brought you here. And for us in the church, if we're going to find our voice in the public sphere, if we're going to contribute to creating this to the fabric of America, if we're going to contribute to creating this theology of American civic faith, we have to go to our first love first. We can't contribute from an empty well. Our well has to be full. We have to really understand what our faith is and what the demands of our faith are on us as people of God. So that's the first step, in my opinion, before we even start to engage and create this counter-narrative around what it means to be people of faith in the public square, what it means to be people of faith who contribute to America's civic faith. It's understanding who we are. I may have a few thoughts on that. Just one or two, or three or four, or five or six or seven or eight. So when I was, back when I was a wee lad and in seminary, I couldn't grow facial hair yet. Now I'm growing a full beard because it's the only place where I gray. And so I want to show that I'm actually a thoughtful person. So I figured, what says it better than having salt and pepper beard, right? That every year gets less than salt and pepper. But when I was in seminary, I never paid much attention to the first chapter of the book of Genesis. Just hadn't, because I grew up in the church, and you just, you hear it all the time. Pastors preach from it. In the beginning there was God, blah, 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 But the part that I really just kind of blew by all the time was that we were created in the image and likeness of God. In the Latin, it's imago and imago Dei, and created in the image and likeness of God. Fast forward a few years, I get to seminary and I start reading the greats, Brueggemann, Barth, Thurman, Renita Weems, who's a great black womanist theologian. I started reading folks like that to really understand what does that mean. And it really kind of hit me is that, we all have a shared humanity. We all are if we're all created in the image and likeness of God, we all have a shared humanity. And to violate the humanity of any one person is to violate God. And so for me, that's my starting point. When I talk about how do we live out our faith in the public square, the starting point is that we all have to understand, as Howard Thurman would say, we all share a spark of the divine. And that has to be the starting point for how we live out our lives in the public square and understand what that means is that we all share a spark of the divine because we're all created in the image and likeness of God. And so to say that someone else is less than God, or to say that someone else eats cats or dogs and therefore they're less than human, is to really commit a sin against God because you're denying that person's basic humanity that we all share with them, that common thread that we all share with them. So for me, thank you. So for me, that has to be the starting point for how we engage. The second part of that is, if we all share that spark of the divine, if we all share that common humanity that comes through the fact that we're created in the image and likeness of God, and because I'm a lawyer, I will say that there was no fine print there. There's no addendum. There's none of the other stuff. We're all created in the image and likeness of God, full stop, in the discussion. If that's true, the next step is, if we love them as we love them, if we love God as we say that we do, we have to love them fully, full stop, in a discussion. Those two things, for me, are the beginning point for how we create this new American civic faith, how those of us who call ourselves people of faith engage in the public square, engage people in the in the open air. And that's also how we reclaim who we are as Christians and how we start to create a counter narrative. Because remember, it didn't say in the New Testament, they shall know us by our cruelty. It didn't say they shall know us by who we exclude. It didn't say they should know us by who we marginalize. It didn't say they shall know us by putting the 10 Commandments in public schools. It didn't say they shall know us by the fact that we're going to have a Bible in every classroom. It didn't say that they shall know us because we institute a Bible-based curriculum in public schools. It says they shall know us by our love. Again, full stop. No disclaimers, no representations, no warranties, none of that stuff. They shall know us by our love. We can't participate in the public square. We can't fully participate in democracy if they don't know us by our love. In fact, we're being disingenuous if we say that we're participating in democracy to show the love of Christ if we really don't show love to people, if our first instinct is to marginalize people. I think this is probably a good place to start because I'll just keep going on. And it's 10:12 according to my watch. And I think at some point, if I get invited back to continue this conversation, I actually want to talk more about how I got to this place theologically at the end of the day, because part of it is Presbyterians are cousins to the Baptists in the Reform movement. And why I note that is that part of the reason Baptists became Baptists, and I'll just give you a preview, maybe a trailer for part 2, if there's ever a part 2, but part of what makes Baptists Baptists is this notion of the separation of church and state and this idea of how people of faith interact in the larger civil community. In fact, Baptists were chased out of Europe because of the idea that we believe, as Baptist folks, that the church and the state had to be separated in order for people to fully live out their spiritual lives. Because the state, as an imperfect being, could not impose the dictates of God on someone's heart. And so in 1619, Thomas Helwys and a bunch of other folks got chased out. Presbyterians are related through the Anabaptists to the Baptists. But that's for a different discussion at a different day. And you'll see me in January because I'm preaching in January, right before the inauguration. And I already have my sermon title. It's called FAFO. For those of you who know what FAFO means. And it comes from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 20, verse 39, if you want to get a preview of what I'm talking about. And the only reason I know already, because the day after the election, that particular text came up. I read the Bible every day. I have a one-year Bible, so it's like broken into 365 segments, so I can get through the Bible every year. And so this came up the day after the election. I'm like, yeah, it's an FAFO moment. For those of you who know what that is, if you don't know what FAFO means, ask Corey. He will tell you. Raise your hand, Corey. So I'll stop here and take any questions except for what FAFO means. Do you really have a question?
He's been waiting. I do. Terrance, thanks for the profile-raising shout-out. I really appreciate that. And, at Montview, we have a long history of welcoming Baptists into the fold, so we can't wait for you to join our membership. Thank you. So I have a logic problem for you, as your fellow lawyer. This is just something I've been thinking about in the news lately. So I won't name names, but, last week there was a news story about the defense secretary nominee who happens to have a tattoo that is a white nationalist tattoo, right?
Right.
However, the symbol is a cross. And so the vice president-elect came to his defense and said, shame on everybody for criticizing this good Christian. He's got a cross on his arm. And so my question for you is, what do we think about that, and how do we contextualize that in this concept of American Christian or of American faith that you're talking about, American civic faith?
Yeah. No, I'm going to thanks, Corey, for that question, and I do remember that. One of the interesting things about Christians of that ilk, because I don't want to speak ill of the ill, if you got what I said, is that they've gaslit the rest of us in terms of what it means to be Christian, and they've appropriated certain symbols and things associated with our faith. It's not unusual. I would be remiss if I said it's a unique thing in the place of history. And it frequently happens when those folks who want to have power need to have a justification for their use of power. And this is one of those things. And I frequently joke, but I'm half serious, that the beginning of white Christian nationalism started with the Council of Nicaea and the Emperor Constantine. I half joke, but I'm very serious about it. If you understand the history of the Council of Nicaea, and this goes to your question, the Emperor Constantine didn't have much use for Christians until he woke up one day. He said he had a vision, but until he realized that you had this insurgency of people, and I mean insurgency broadly in a nonviolent sense, but you had this insurgency of people who called themselves Christians within his empire. And he says, these people might become a problem. How do I co-opt these people? And he was like, I'll just co-opt their faith, because there's a lot of them. And so he decided to bring all the bishops together, locked them in Nicaea, and said, you all figure all your stuff out, get your doctrine together. They couldn't figure it out. So what he did was he locked them in a room, put guards around the council building, and wouldn't let them out until they came up with the Nicene Creed. That's essentially what happened. That's a longer conversation. That's the first co-optation of the Christian faith. That particular cross that that person, I'll stick with your thing, is wearing has a long history of being associated with, not just in the modern era, but historically, with the use of using Christianity and using Christianity as a justification for acting violently against people who aren't Christian. From what I understand, it has its first origins during the Crusades. The idea behind it was that we're warriors of Christ seeking out the infidels. And historically, it has been used as a way to impose white Christian nationalism thought or over the ages within the conversation about who is and who is not Christian. Where those of us who aren't of that ilk fail is that we frequently don't understand the history of our own faith well enough to actually combat it in real time. And this is where I still consider myself a Democrat, although maybe not a really good Democrat. This is where I sometimes have issues with my party, especially those people in my party who consider themselves people of faith, is that I sometimes feel like we don't take studying our own faith seriously enough in terms of understanding our history and understanding the scripture and understanding theology and being able to engage in what they teach you in seminary is called apologia, or being an apologist for the faith. And so we don't push back hard enough. And then members of the media don't understand and Christian symbolism and Christian faith, and they don't bring on the right people to talk about things sometimes. So when they do, they don't bring in someone who can call J.D. Vance out in real time or can have a real discussion about it. So that's kind of my long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you so much for the history lessons. I want to hear more. I think a lot of us will. Regarding your statement right up front that we are not going to have to play out just what has happened in the past, and we talked about Nazi Germany, you mentioned that we have a whole future that we get to bring into reality. I would like to hear if you have any examples, even one example, of a country that might have found itself in a situation similar to ours that had a vision that it could bring into reality that might give us some possibilities to consider today.
That's a good question. I had not anticipated that question. Yeah, I'll just email you. My people get in touch with your people. In fact, I will talk about the history of this country, actually, because as much as our country has a problematic history, it also has a history of resiliency. And as a black person in this country, let me rewind. In the black community since the election, there's been a whole lot of conversation about what does this mean for black folks, especially black women. And in this regard, I completely stand with black women in that, we put a lot of effort into a lot of things in this country in terms of raising alarm bells, waving red flags, saying, hey, pay attention, this dude means what he says he means. Put a lot of effort into that. So there's been a lot of conversation in the black community about what does this mean for us going forward. Do we check out? And right now, I think the feeling for a lot of folks in the black community is one part complete anger at white folks. I mean, I'm not saying I'm one of those people, but I'm just telling you what's out there since we're among friends and we're all family in this sanctuary right here. So there's a lot of anger. And part of that is also an FAFO moment. This is what they wanted. This is what they're going to get. All right? And I'm getting to the answer to your question because I think that this context is very important. So black folks, our history in this country is full of examples of what you said, because at every step along the way in this country, we've had to overcome some barrier, we've had to break through some glass ceiling, and we've had to deal with some level of laws, religious doctrine, political ideology, et cetera, that degraded us because of our race, that marginalized us because of what we look like and because of where we come from. So as a people, we have a great deal of experience, unfortunately, with having to live through periods of American history that were uncertain and unclear, and in fact, periods of American history where our voices were not only not heard, but disregarded and actively suppressed. This could be one of those periods again. Don't know. Certain a great deal of fear around it, enough to create anxiety. For us, though, and this is the conversation I'm starting to hear in my circles of people that I'm around, we know how to deal with it. And we've overcome it. We've been resilient. That's one of the reasons why when we sing, Lift Every Voice and Sing, it has so much meaning for us, and it's so soul-stirring for us when we sing it as a people, as black folks especially. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, but yet we're still here. Or as it says in the, I just kind of talked about it earlier this week. We've been beaten, but we're not crushed. So yeah, I think if you just look at the community I come from, there's an example of surviving, and not just surviving, overcoming. So even if things get dark, there has to be some hope. And in the history of the Christian church and the reason that our faith, my faith, has the meaning that it has to me, is that I understand, not just academically, I understand at the very deepest pits of my soul that no matter what human beings do around me, as the pianist played earlier, it is well with my soul. When peace like a river attendeth my soul, it is still well with my soul. And I come from a tradition like the little old black lady in the Montgomery bus boycott. And they asked her, they said, "Aren't you tired from doing all this walking?" She says, "My feet may be tired, but my soul is no way weary." And I think for those of us, especially for me, I'm not going to lie, the week after the election, I was a hot mess. It took me at least 3 or 4 days for me to get up and start functioning again. You would not have wanted to be in my condo. Thank God for the air diffuser, because I didn't even make it to the shower. It was awful. I finally got tired of myself. But I had to remind myself that I come from a stock of people who, if they had given up, if they had lost hope, if they had lost faith, we would still be in chains on someone's plantation somewhere. Amen. So now, even though it appears that the world has lost its bearings, Dr. King said the moral arc of the universe is long and it still bends towards justice. But for it to bend and continue to bend, we have work that we have to do. We have to engage in the public square. We have to provide a counter-narrative. We don't have the luxury of sitting around and wallowing. We just don't. So I probably have time for one more question. It's 10:28. I don't know if I have time for a question. No?
You're good.
Ordained Presbyterian ministers aren't asked to ask questions.
Well, I'm actually just echoing, and I'm echoing what you just said, because Jamar Tisby, we had, that we did a couple weeks ago, and he echoed your words by saying we tend to look at Bonhoeffer for these moments, which is fine, and the confessing church, which is fine, but we don't have to look that far. We have the Black Christian church and its tradition here in this country during hard times, and their resiliency and their faith and their willingness to be tenacious in holding hope. And so his encouragement is for us to claim the Black Christian narrative in our history as resistance and resiliency. So I just found that very helpful, and I find your words very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, and I completely agree with him. I'll tell you that weekend after after the election, it was the same week as the Church of God in Christ's 116th Holy Convocation. And for those of you who don't know the Church of God in Christ, it's the largest Black Pentecostal denomination in the world, 6.5 million members. And their annual Holy Convocation, they had 20-some thousand people in Memphis. Me being the preacher nerd that I am, I watched it online. I watched it streaming every day. It's what kept me going when I was in that dark place for that week. That and my therapist. I'm all about therapy. But from a spiritual perspective, that kept me going for that week because it reminded me of the traditions that I grew up in terms of like those old church deacons. They're like, Jesus on the main line, tell him what you want, things like that. And it kept reminding me that the fight is not for right now. the hope that we have, the faith that we have, it's not just for the right now, it's for the future, it's for our children's children, and it's also a reminder that we take seriously our faith. Hope is always there. No matter how dark it is, hope is always there. And that's probably one of the things I learned as a child of the Black church. There's always hope, and there's always faith. So thank you, and I'm sorry I missed him too, because I don't know what was going on, why I was not here, but anyway. I was preaching at St. Thomas that weekend, and I was like holed up getting ready to preach. That's exactly what I was doing. I'm glad you remember my schedule better than I do.
You're preaching on Martin Luther King Sunday.
Yep, I am. I may shave my beard by then, I'm not sure. Thank you again. I believe I'm at time. Thank you very much for having me. Hopefully we can continue this conversation. And for those of you who read about I write, I'm going back to writing in January for the Denver Post after taking about a year off. It's probably time to start writing again after taking a little break. I had to figure out how to be a lawyer again, but now I'll get back to writing. Thank you very much for everything.